Circumstances often dictate or limit our opportunities or the lack thereof. Of course, we all have options that we can change our lot in life. However, in many parts of the country, where you're born often determines or limits what you're going to become. Now, we often associate these situations with large inner city programs and large inner city systems. Unfortunately, small rural towns face many of the same circumstances. Now, I've heard things in these rural areas like, what we do is good enough for your grandparents, it's good enough for your parents, and it's going to be good enough for you. College is a luxury we just simply can't afford. And people who live in this community do this for a living. We need to break this cycle. How are we going to break it? We're going to find out today. My guest is Tristan Schmidt. Now, he grew up in rural America, and he's working in education to help change this generational cycle. Let's meet him today. Tristan, welcome to Life Altering Events.
Hello.
Let me tell the world a little bit about you. He's a University of Iowa alumnus with a Bachelor of Arts in African American Studies, a minor in Human Relations, a certificate in Critical Cultural Competency. Think about that one. He's going to talk about that. He earned a Master's of Public Affairs at Indiana University and is currently working toward a graduate certificate in Quantitative Research and Inquiry Methodology. This is an impressive young man. So once again, welcome to Life Altering Events. All right, Tristan, tell us a little bit about your background. How did this happen?
Yeah, no, well, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Tristan. It's a long story, but I usually find some place to start is usually I consider myself somebody who is altruistic, somebody who believes in the greater good, in the common good and everything. And a lot of that comes from my experiences growing up. Particularly, I grew up as a military kid, and so I was born in Germany to military mom, military dad, and then my mom retired after she had me. Then my sister came along a year later, so my family was super busy. And then we moved to South Korea when I was, I believe, 3 or 4. Lived there for a little bit, then moved all over the East Coast US. And then eventually my dad was like, I got my 20 years, let me retire. And now then we moved back to Iowa where my dad grew up. We moved into his childhood home and we went to his hometown, everything. I went to school where he went to school, middle school, high school. I even had a librarian that was still, I believe, the same librarian that he had. And so it was definitely interesting and that I definitely got to experience that. Oh, well, this is where I went to school, so I guess you're going to go to school here too. Um, Now, where that gets interesting is, being particularly in a rural community for the rest of my like adolescent years, is just noticing the difference between the experiences I had prior to coming to Iowa and then coming to and then being in Iowa itself. Particularly, traveling around the world, I was in a lot of spaces where often was the person who was a minority, or I was only the only person who may have only spoke one language. For
Right.
example, in international spaces, like a lot of the spaces I would go into, there were people who would speak multiple languages. But I was the only one who spoke English. Now, that's a whole other different level of policy that we can get into, but ultimately, it really did have an effect on me growing up in a rural community. Particularly, I grew up in a town of 7,000.
Mm.
Not bad, but I mean, as a teenager who grew up traveling all over the world, when you're then moving to a rural community that is then like isolated from a big city by, like, let's say 50 minutes, if I remember correctly, it was 55 minutes to the nearest big city.
Hmm.
Wasn't even that big. It's Waterloo, Iowa, and it was home to University of Northern Iowa at the time. I thought, oh wow, this is such a big metropolis, but lo and behold, now I go to places like like Columbus or Indianapolis, and I'm like, dang, this ain't big enough for me yet.
Hmm.
And you know, going to the University of Iowa really had a substantial effect on me. Particularly, my parents not my parents, my mom definitely kickstarted the journey of like, you're going to go to school. Your first generation. I don't want you to work as hard as your dad and I had to just to make ends meet. You're going to go to school. So it was kind of built into me that I was going to go down this path. Particularly, I ended up at the University of Iowa, where I study African American studies, human relations, cultural competence, which are also very interesting paths for me to end up on because just generally very blankly, I'm a white person. You don't see a lot of white people studying African studies, African American studies, or ethnic studies in general.
Correct.
But what I found through that whole experience is that I got to revisit some old memories I had, some old experiences I have, and reinterrogate them or re-experience them through a new light, through a new lens. I got to learn more about my own background because of these courses. Not saying that these courses, only spoke about X, Y, or Z, but they talked about the relationship between people, relationship between things, concepts, institutions, these constructs that we have in life. And that's really what kind of kept me in the major. And what drew me to it was the fact that I was able to then reinterpret all these things I've come to know and have to unlearn and relearn new and relearn things. They say that there's the hidden curriculum, for example, in higher education, of the things you're supposed to know what to do, supposed to, where you're supposed to go, all these different things, all these different tips and tricks. No idea for me and many others like me who were first gen, low income, all that stuff. And so, it really is interesting just how I ended up on the journey I did because, when I graduated, I was like, one big question that everyone asked me was like, what do you do with your degree? And I was like, oh gosh, I, at the time I was kind of like, why am I going to do my degree? But I've found lots of opportunities to utilize it and, you know, bring those experiences to the forefront of all the work I do, in the work I do with my students, working in Trio Upward Bound now. I've just been able to do so many things, but the nice thing that I share with many of the students I work with is that rural community piece, growing up in a rural community. A lot of the students I
Wow.
work with, they're in towns of like 3,000 or less. I have one town that's maybe 30,000, which is when I was a kid, that would have been huge. But I go there now, and there are differences between places like Iowa City, a bigger city in the Midwest, and a small rural community like Columbus Junction or Columbus City or Muscatine or any of those places that I work in, which all are great, but they also have just different contexts to them. And I definitely think I'll get on this later, but for example, you mentioned in that kind of opening, you mentioned this is the way we've always kind of done it, bringing up kind of the rural life. You don't leave your community. You kind of just
Sure.
stay there. You just it's the recreation of the cycle. And it's not to say that if you choose that, that's a bad thing. It's not at all. But the fact is that a lot of people just don't get that choice or the
That's right.
opportunity in itself.
That's
And
right.
that agency, I think, is so central to creating a healthy and functioning, at least to me, healthy and functioning society where people are able to make decisions for themselves and what they want to do on their own. But I also know it's not that simple because also the students I work with, particularly trio students, they come from a lot of communities that are very different in how they live and interpret and engage with the world. For example, I work with a lot of students who are Latino, Latina. There's different family dynamics compared to my students who are, for example, white or African American. There's just different cultural contexts in those households too. That just
Exactly.
makes up a lot of different
Exactly.
things.
You mentioned you worked with Upward Bound, but you are a product of Upward Bound, correct? When we spoke before, how did that help you? What did Upward Bound do for you? What doors did it open?
Well, actually, so I was not a participant myself in Upward Bound. I was an Upward Bound eligible. I was eligible. I was a trio
Ah,
eligible student, but this gets into it again. The kind of rural aspect is that in northeast rural Iowa and many rural parts of the nation, there's these programs could serve so many students out there, but they just don't have that reach. And it's not saying that for lack of trying. No, we want more trio programs. We want more of these things so we can have more of these opportunities. For example, I was first gen, lower income family, and I qualified for trio all the way around, but there were no programs in our area.
Right.
At least the nearest program was I believe the one at, yeah, I don't think it existed at the time. I think it was one University of Iowa, and that was at the when I lived with my parents back in Boyd, Iowa. It's 2.5 hours 2.5 hours south. So
Hmm.
like my parents were not gonna
No, that's not
have
going
me
to
do,
happen.
have them do that. No, they were like, it's already hard enough to do some traveling then, and so it really creates a void. There's a gap in kind of these educational services or opportunities to engage in what's life going to be like after high school, after I'm done with this. Is there more than just, let's say, going to a position at the factory, which is, again, not a bad thing at all, but it's just kind of making sure that we're aware of the realities that there are so many more opportunities that do exist and can exist for people. For example, I when Upward Bound, and how I think of it in really, it still has helped me. It has helped me as someone who's grown into my identity as a first generation college graduate. Um, Now getting ready for other things in life and all that stuff. It's just really, I think back about how much that time being in higher education has really helped me grow into a person that can really sit down and have and examine, why am I doing this? What are the values? What am I doing this for? So on and so forth. And so that education, higher education particularly, showed me that there is more to the world than what I see or what I hear, but there's so much more. For example, I got to go do so many different things, and because of higher education, I got to go to Philly for like a week and a half and study homeless research policy, talk with city councilors, talk with different government stakeholders about these different things. But I would not have had this if I hadn't been able to go and do these things. And
Hmm.
that kind of goes to another part, is also what are our institutions doing to support these students that do want to reach for that dream, that do want to go for that. I had, and I'll get this later, but like, for example, I'm at our institution, there's certain scholarships and grants that exist to support students who are from backgrounds like my own, like low income, first generation, where the only reason I was able to go to school is because of that. And there's changes coming down the pipeline that's no longer going to be a reality or possibility for some students. And I know there are so many students who are like me who will rely solely on that scholarship or solely on the financial aid because your parents don't want to sign something, because they don't want to give up this piece of information, because for me at least, my dad's not the biggest fan of the government. He doesn't like trust. He doesn't like signing things. Like, doesn't like giving any numbers or anything like that. And so it was like playing. It's like playing hide and seek at the dark and trying to just do all these different things at once. And you know, I will always appreciate the people that were there with me though along the way with it, particularly rural educators. I'll say that kind of experience of rural education and being in a rural community is that when, at least for me, there were a lot of rural educators who truly envisioned and saw a future for me. And there were a lot of competing voices that were like, no, you should go to do X, Y, or Z. You should go to apprenticeship. You should go to military. Go X, Y, or Z. All are great options, but I looking back, I know that this path going down education definitely was the best for me. And it gave me the opportunity to really define the story of my life and my family.
Hmm.
I get to say, hey, I'm now the first person in our family to have a bachelor's degree and master's degree. And I fun fact, I got accepted to a PhD program recently, so I can share
For
that.
real.
Yeah, so now I'm on the tail end of it, and now I get to be closer to being the first person in my family with a PhD, the first doctor,
PhD. That's
which is
big.
so
That is
cool.
big.
And
Let's
so,
go back. Let's go step back, Tristan, to your degree in humanities. One of my daughters has a degree in sociology, archaeology, right? And at first you think, are you going to make any money doing this? But as I found out with her and with talking to you, it's all about relationships and connections. And that's what humanities people and graduates understand. And that's what's lacking. How has that helped you?
oh yes, when you go into a humanities degree, you will often get pressed at the very start. Are you sure you want to do that? Or are you sure there's money in it? Or are you sure that you'll really be happy in it? Well, one, I know you I know before you told me I'm probably not gonna go in for the money. That's probably not my end goal by going into this. But ultimately, it really is just something that I loved and something that I learned to learn more about myself through. I saw college as an opportunity. Let's take a step back. I think it's how you perceive going into college. Are you going into it with the idea that I'm going here so I can get a degree, so I can make more money, so I can do X, Y, or Z? What is the ends that you are trying to justify? And for me, I no one in my family had gone before, and so I had this open-ended definition I could make for myself. No, I had no expectation of what to do, just other than to go and do it. And so
Right.
and then my own self expectation of like, you better be good at doing this too. Which is a whole nother aspect of being first gen, is the level of expectations that come with it. But particularly, being first gen and lower income, I my parents never told me, but I always felt called that I had to do something that would make me money, so I didn't end up in similar situations. So I didn't end up struggling, or so my parents weren't always questioning me about like, what am I going to do with this degree? But for me, at least later on, my mom was my biggest cheerleader, and then later on my dad joined alongside. He was a little bit of a critic at first about the humanities, but he came around to it, particularly just because it taught me, and when I later shared it with my family, like, it taught us how to truly understand people more and situations more, the context of the things we're doing more. It helps uncover these different events of the past and re-examine them for new lights, and then also be able to generate new thoughts about how we can move through the future. For example, we've in the humanities, we revisit the past consistently, so we can know, hey, this has happened, this has been replicated before, let's try a different thing, let's try something new, maybe let's try something that hasn't been done. And for me, with my humanities degree, I knew going in, I was like, I know I'm going to be underestimated on the job market. I know I'm going to be taken in. I know people are going to see that degree and be like, ooh, maybe there's an advantage we can take of this, or something like that. But
Mhm.
no, it's about how you make. It's about, for me, when I work with students, when I tell them about a degree and choosing something they love, that's when the question of like, but I want to make money. You can still make money doing something and studying in the humanities. You just have to be able to market it and showcase different skill sets. For example, I I knew going into it, hey, my classes are going to be mostly talking, mostly lecture based, mostly interaction, mostly these kind of discussions. I wasn't going to be working on a computer. I wasn't be doing any statistical analysis, any data changes or things like that, so on and so forth. So I took it upon myself. I have to find opportunities to engage in these skills and build them up at the same time, because that's one of the very one of the ways that I thought, one, change the message about the humanities. If I'm in there in those spaces as a person in the humanities themselves, and also a humanities scholar, and I can exhibit these skills, I can maybe we slowly change the perception that people have of the humanities and what they're capable of. That's one thing. And another thing is, kind of how I've heard it described before, is imagine someone being able to understand people and then the numbers that
Boom.
represent the people.
There it is, right there.
Yeah, being able to understand the context of the data you're using is so crucial. And I think I mentioned this before, but like, for example, for TRIO, we use free reduced lunch numbers to kind of identify socioeconomic status. So that's a proxy. Well, if you don't know the like guidelines tables or the information for what a federal poverty income guidelines are, you that free or reduced lunch number, that's just a number of students who are getting free or reduced lunch. But once you understand the context of that number, what that meaning has behind it, you understand, no, these aren't just students who are getting free or reduced lunch. This is us showing like, hey, these are the number of students we have that are experiencing situations in which, you know finances are not in their favor, or there's things happening in the community that are creating these discrepancies and disparities. And that's one thing that I found. And also, a professor once told me, because she was in the humanities, and then she was in the humanities in undergrad and got a graduate degree in a more quantitative field. But she told me, oh, always have an extra skill in your back pocket to surprise them, because you never know when that place, time, the place, setting, and opportunity may arise for you to showcase that, and really create a new image for what a humanities scholar is or looks like, and I think about it in that, these fields are super crucial to understanding just why are we having the issues we have. Why are we facing issues in terms of the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Exactly. Exactly. You said something earlier that struck with me. Tristan, Professor Edward Hess at University of Virginia, the Darden School, is a futurist. And he said to me, he said, the skill set that's going to thrive going forward is the ones who can, what you said, learn, unlearn, and relearn because it's changing too fast. And people who can say, because I came from the business side, finance, and they want data. Oh, look at all this data. So what? How, until data becomes information, as you told me before, it's meaningless. That's a big skill you've developed. Touch on that. How does that play?
Oh, yes. You know, for example, working in my own students, I use a program called R Studio. Now, if you are listening to this and you're familiar with R, you probably rolled your eyes to the back of your head. If you're not, well, kind of imagined a very, 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 very unfriendly version of Microsoft Excel. Now, it was not easy to learn that, but being able to develop that skill, one, not only have I been able to navigate, interpret that new ways of learning and data and be able to combine different theories with practical application, but also, hey, I've made it so that I'm competitive in the job market. I'm competitive as a scholar, as a researcher. Not it's not very easy for someone to say I've I can do quantitative, qualitative, humanistic kind of methods of inquiry. It's just it there's it's just kind of it's research is hard. So being able to have those kind of different skill sets is truly awesome. And it really is about how you make use of those skills and the information. But also another thing I think that is really crucial to touch on is the why of why you're getting this information. A lot of the times I know that when you make data requests, for example, at the University of Iowa, um, a lot of times they ask, just generally, why are you looking for this data? That's a question I encourage a lot of researchers and people to ask themselves, like, why am I looking for this information? And if you understand the why, I think that's another added step. You can create a story to tell with it too. For example, if I'm looking at my students' grades and GPAs and I'm putting this data into the software to kind of get an idea. Yeah, I want to know how they're doing. I want to know if our services are effective, but overall, I want to know if Upward Bound is truly having the impact that we say we are, and how if we're not, how we can change that, and if we are, how can we keep doing those great things, and all in a way of trying to make the program better for and the ends for students better, make their goals a reality instead of just something that they talk about. That's and I would say another big thing is, you know when I work with students is having conversations about this making yourself marketable, being able to have these different skill sets even though you want to study one thing, being able to be a multidisciplinarian, someone who is also a generalist in a way, because that flexibility will allow you to do so many things in just so many different ways that some people may not even thought of. For example, going into my first job out of college, I was working in disability advocacy and respite services. You know,
Mhm.
because of my background in African American studies and cultural competence, I understood there's a lot more different cultural context about how disability is understood within specific ethnic, racial, or religious communities. And also just that cultural competence component allowed me to understand. Hey, if I'm feeling uncomfortable, in a space with people who are different identities than me, and they all have the similar identity, and I don't, and I'm the one uncomfortable. Maybe that's something that I should interrogate. That's not the fault of the people around me, but that's just something that, hey, this is something that's uncomfortable with me, and I need to be able to unpack it. And that's the biggest skill, honestly, that I've taken away from my degree. That's kind of really forced me into being uncomfortable with my own skin at times, is understanding, the world and the way that people talk about the world on news outlets, all these different things. It's only one side of this whole entire fractal image of different things. That's little that I think it was the ACDC spectrum light thing or the prism. It's kind of like that. You think it's that two, it's the just one going in, but no, it's all these different things going into and coming out of it. And sometimes we're only listening to the red when there's still the rest of the rainbow going on.
Exactly.
So
That's exactly right. That's tremendous. Now, many programs, we talked about this a few weeks ago, many programs that fall in diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're under attack. And we're seeing a lot of pressure to shift to a research or an accreditation and remove some of these programs. And you told me that's an ill-advised model. Explain that.
yeah, one, I believe it posits that diversity and equity are actions instead of these things that we strive for, these goals. This these it one, I think we're starting to enter this really weird period, not weird, but unprecedented. I can't even say unprecedented. This just
There it was.
turbulent time in higher education. There we go. Turbulent time in higher education or education in general, where it's not so much more about the quality of an education, but kind of almost just just general control over what can be said, what can be done, what can be taught, who can be taught, where they can be taught, all these things. It's not a coincidence that there's big lawsuits going on about certain things and there's no coincidence that in the same year that affirmative action went down, all these other things following it also happened.
Yes.
These are not coincidental. These are all coordinated in their own way. And being able to recognize that is I one way that you can stay informed of this kind of situation, and also understanding the kind of thought process behind it. Because for the longest time, I was just like, I don't understand. Like, is there not this understanding that these programs really do a justice for our students? But and then the day for some of the proponents who are arguing to end DEI, it was never about the students. It's always kind of been about this control, ever since from the start of higher education, from the starting formation of US's original like smaller number of school districts to now the many multiple fractured school districts we have. Everything in education has been political. Everything's been made to kind of be a weapon or some sort of tool or means or way to achieve a political goal. But that's not what education is there for. Education is not meant to serve as a tool to help someone's campaign or to help them get a revenue boost, but as a way to really serve the people and the society and its future. And when you start having these things where we're going to end DEI because we feel it's discriminatory, it's really antithetical to kind of the it's just kind of antithetical in itself, because when we're talking about DEI, diversity, it's it's not saying, I'll just say it's not saying that it's like, oh, this only non-white, non-male, X, Y, or Z, these non-dominants. No, diversity is inclusive of everybody. That's why we say diversity. When you say the rainbow, when you say a rainbow, you assume all the colors are under it. You don't just assume we're talking about, orange, yellow, green, blue, all these, and forgetting about red. No, red's still included. Maybe we're focusing on one of these colors because that one stands out a little bit more. Or maybe we see this one more in this light, for example. And
Right.
and also it's a period of financial and political austerity too. We're getting more and more. I would say been a big rise of professional financial educators, which is never a bad thing. I always think that personal financial education is such a crucial thing, and it's such a skill that people need to learn. but it's starting to become almost its own private market space in a way that, hey, let's start talking about financial planning for college. And that's also another thing, is how corporations, all these privatized spaces, are starting to enter the world of education and try to make it almost not take away, but remold it in an image that's kind of what they want. And a lot of the times, you see so these high level people like Mr. Elon Musk on news saying DEI must die, but it's like, you are one person within the sea of people and stories that have been through so many different things, that this is crucial for them and crucial for their experiences. And there are people out there who, they may been have burned in the past by something, or they may have got accepted to something. You'd be surprised. I've heard wild stories of people will hold grudges for different things, but at the end of it, a lot of times it's people feeling like they aren't heard, or feeling like they cannot have their voice heard. And that's that when I've had discussions with people, or uncomfortable conversations with people, a lot of the times it comes from that one of those places. It comes from either that place or the place of, I need control, because without control, I don't know what I'm doing. And that's I think a bigger message in kind of how we as a society in the United States function. We're very individualistic. We're very much focused on I, me, mine now. And
Hmm.
it's very, if you consider the way that some ways of education work, and the way that learning works, and how people
Okay, we froze here a little bit. Let's see if we come back. Hopefully. Well, in the event, until we get Tristan back here, one of the things that he and I spoke about earlier was, in an earlier conversation, is that access, just get somebody in the door. It's not a handout. It opens the door. Once they're in the door, then it's up to them to determine what they're going to do with it, where they're going to go, and how it's going to be. And remember, President Kennedy said at one point, a rising tide lifts all boats. The more people who get access, the more people who have opportunity, the more people who can make a livable income, the better it is for the overall community. So we'll see if we can get Tristan back here in a minute or so. And the other issue that we saw when I spoke with him earlier was, here he comes again. When I spoke to him earlier was the there's a fear. He's mentioned the fear as he comes back here. We talked about this fear that he had mentioned. And when he comes back with audio, we're going to get into that for a second. All right,
sorry
you're just
about
about back. No problem. No
sorry
problem.
about that. I
No
don't know what
problem.
happened,
No
but
problem. We kept
um,
going.
yeah.
I want to jump in here with this, Tristan. You talked about fear just before you left, and I was just mentioning that while we were waiting for you to come back. I interviewed Dr. Rebecca McLeod at the University of California, University of Central Florida, professor or PhD, and she said there is a fear that expanding inclusion is going to take seats away from the table. I'm going to have something taken from me if we let everybody else in the door. And she said, inclusion allows us to build a bridge to have a bigger table. What are your thoughts on that?
Ooh, I always think the table analogy is so interesting, because I'm just like, why? Well, my first question is always like, why are we talking about a table? Why does it have to be a table? Why can we not have like, why can we not just build this space where everyone's welcome, where all these things are happening? But again, that requires us to do a couple different things with a lot of time, money, and power that we just do not have yet, but we will one day.
Yes.
Um, but in terms of the fear, I think it's realizing at some point, the history of everything I've learned is flawed. And that cognitive dissonance, when I started my program in African American studies, the level of cognitive dissonance I had on the daily was astronomical. However, because of that discomfort, I was able to learn a lot about myself, but more importantly, I was able to expand a lot of my different horizons and in my own interests, tastes, hobbies, because of being able to engage in different things. For example, my first year living on campus, I decided, I want to take a chance. I want to live on the global mosaic floor. So we had living learning communities, which are these themes for our floors. I was on the floor where basically for the global mosaic, it was students from all over US. I know there were a lot of students that were from China. We had a couple from India, Germany, Argentina, Colombia, just different places like that. And at first I was like, oh, it's super weird. I don't know any of these people. I don't know any of them. And like, what if they don't speak? My assumption was at the time, like, what if they don't speak English or things like that? Obviously, very like linguistically ethnocentric thought in time, but like having to have a moment where I had to sit down and had, we had a potluck, for example, at the end of our first week. By the end of that, we were all just like super close and super, super happy all the time. And we were always going in each other's rooms and spaces and cooking. But the one thing I remember specifically about that is we all brought our own dishes from our own kind of backgrounds. And we were like, we want to like really be representative of like, the fact that we're a global mosaic of these different pieces. Now, mosaic, melting pot, those analogies aside, because all those, that's a whole other thing. It was really, truly awesome to then taste food I had never thought I'd taste before, to give things a new chance, a new try, to make new friendships with people I never ever thought I'd end up having in my life. And, those people are now my best friends, people I now expect to, for big life events, people I expect to have in my life. Um, and from that, I also, not only was I able to gain something, but I was able to expand the way that I engage with the world. Now if I go to a place and um for example, working at all our school, because I grew up, I was on this global mosaic floor. We had a lot of food that came from Latin America. So a lot of times, we had tamales, enchiladas, tortas, all these kind of different culturally centered foods. And with my students, we'll talk about these things, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, I remember we've had those when I was on campus. They were like, well, you've had that before? And it's like, yeah, no, and it's a great way, one, to build rapport and build a connection with others. Which when you start building that bridge and making that bigger table, you start also seeing that, I would say that it's not just one table, but there's a whole bunch of tables out there. There's
That's right.
a lot of kid tables, and a lot of kids want to come up to that big table. And so we just have to keep building onto it and adding more seats. And, hey, who says we have to have a number of seats to limit it? Maybe it's just one big long buffet table that we're all just kind of sitting and chilling at together. But
Exactly.
I think if you're not building the table, or if you're not bringing somebody to it, at least being sure that whatever you're putting on the table will help people.
Yes,
I think that's also another thing, is we talk about the seats on the table, but it's also, what are you contributing to the table? You
exactly.
know,
Exactly. And we saw in the business side, the world I came from, there's this is what we do and this is how we do it. And just like we said in the beginning, and what I've said to many, many corporate CEOs is, you're the ones that got to change. You have to change because the young people coming in already have these beliefs and thoughts and are more accepting. And if you're not going to be able to draw those kind of people into your organization. That's going to be a big problem. Well, Tristan, this has been amazing. This is a wonderful conversation, a lot of dialogues, and open up a lot of conversation after the fact here. But we're just about out of time. What last thoughts do you want to leave with the audience around the world today?
um, ooh, I will say that I'm not saying this all out of a vacuum. I've been someone who has both benefited and been a victim of different processes of what is happening. As someone who works in higher education and diversity, equity, and inclusion, I am I've both been a beneficiary of these programs, but I've also, by virtue of being an institutional employee, I also take away from them at times. And I think there's nothing wrong with admitting that. I think I'm coming to terms with the relationships we have with the world and things around us is super crucial to understanding how can we work together to save these things, or how can we build coalition together. Because that kind of self-awareness, that consciousness is super crucial. And so that's something that I always try to lead people is, how much time have you taken today to really look at the world around you and say, this is the place I occupy, this is the position I hold, this is the things I do. and really ask yourself, is this really what I want to hold myself to? That's the biggest thing I've been working on with my students lately, is the why. Is why are you doing this? Why are we doing these things? How can we connect who you are, what you want to do, with the things you're good at? How can we connect you with opportunities that might help you blossom into a newer person, might help you transform into a greater advocate, all these different things. And then secondly, I would say that there's as much as there's talking about taking away from things in education, or like stripping things or reducing, um, there are not the people who grew up in the system, in this beginning fracture of the system, back when we had No Child Left Behind to now Every Student Succeeds Act. You know, we have a whole generation of people who went through those policies and are now teachers, or are now going to become teachers. And so I know there's a lot of times on the news, it's always this kind of dread and despair, like this thing's changing for the worse. There are a lot more people in the system who are who are against these things than there are. And it's not saying like an opposition, like we have to win, because I think to say you win or lose this battle of control and education really defeats the meaning and purpose of education, because it's not a battle you win or lose. It's
It's
not a
not to be won or lost. It's to be something experienced and growth from.
exactly.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I bet there's a lot of people going to want to talk to you, Tristan. So how do they get a hold of you?
Of course, yes, no. I can be reached at, you can email me, Tristan, Tristan dash Schmidt, SCHMIDT at uiowa.edu. If you go online, you just type in capital C, capital I, capital A, capital E, and then Tristan Schmidt, you'll find me. But ultimately, you can also catch me on LinkedIn, at Tristan dash A dash Schmidt.
And all this information will be available when this goes public. We'll have all your contact information. So as I said, we're just about out of time. I want to thank Tristan Schmidt again for showing up and for his approach and view on how we break these generational models and how we create not a new environment, but a better environment. Now, as I said, you can see this on my podcast, which is called Life Altering Events. It's on my YouTube channel. It will be on Parade Deck. And I'll send links to Tristan. He can put it everywhere he puts things in his world. If you use the YouTube channel, please subscribe. And let me leave you with this. None of us are in this alone. And the secret to walking on water is to know where the rocks are. And today, Tristan showed us where many of those rocks are. Join me again next week. We'll get into another life-altering event. Tristan, thank you again.